Namaste and welcome to Vichaar Manthan's first Global Sustainable Narratives Conference, taking place virtually as much of our lives are these days. My name is Vidhu Sharma and I'll be walking you through the next half an hour of the opening ceremony for Sustainable Narratives 2020. We have a fantastic 4 days lined up for you with some of the brightest minds of our times. From Professor Gadsad to Suhag Shukla, Amish Tripathi, Professor Lou Marinoff and Shashi Tharoor, this is a platform for us to tussle and play with the many and diverse narratives which make up our society today and earnestly explore them in light of sustainability. Vichaar Manthan is an independent voluntary organization which engages in open dialogue with members of society and institutions to explore issues facing modern Britain through a Hindu civilizational lens. Through this virtual conference, we hope to trigger a new kind of churn of ideas. The intention is not that you leave with any answers, but that you in fact leave with more questions and you take these Manthans into your personal lives and continue to dig deep for the truth. Over the next 4 days, we'll be hosting a series of online panel discussions and fireside conversations. Consider it a space for the sharpest thinkers of our times to come together and explore the big questions facing humanity today. Now, before we get into what those questions are, it's worth me clarifying what Vichaar Manthan believes a sustainable narrative should be able to do. We at Vichaar Manthan believe that narratives must be able to stand up to scrutiny and reason. We believe that they must stand the test of time and that they must enhance the human experience. So we'll be asking 5 big questions this weekend about the prevailing narratives which make up our society and whether or not they fulfill that criteria. Those 5 questions are around the 5 cornerstones that make up any given society: governance, religion, economics, culture, and civics. Over the next couple of minutes, allow me to guide you through what we mean by those 5 different cornerstones. Now, our first panel, which is starting in roughly 27 minutes, will be about sustainable governance in a rapidly changing world. The main question being, how will we cope as a global community transitioning from a unipolar world where the US holds all of the military, commercial, and cultural power to a tripolar world with the unabashed emergence of China as a superpower and the rise of India, which is set to triple in economic and military size in just the next 10 years, according to the IMF. How will we govern such a world? Who will hold the power? The environment, the resources, migration, humanity, pandemics, war. What will be the rule book? Who will police these rules? So come and join us in 26 minutes now for a panel discussion with a dynamic bunch of global speakers. I promise you'll regret missing out on this one. Our second panel is taking place tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. BST, and it will be on institutionalized religion. And we'll be asking, what is the purpose of institutionalized religions in a technological world where we no longer rely on it for the answers to the universe? There once was a time when we would go to religion solely for answers to do with the physical world. And now they don't offer such insight. Now they offer advice about death and the afterlife and mental health and well-being. So just imagine for one moment that if by 2050 we've managed to harness technology to such an extent that it completely eradicates any issues that we have to do with well-being and the entire question of it becomes redundant, then what purpose will religion serve? Can religion continue to operate in the public domain, or must it be part of our private lives in order to survive? So come and join us tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. UK time for an in-depth conversation about that. Our third panel will be taking place on Saturday, again at the same time, 6 p.m. BST, and it will be about sustainable wealth. What is the state of the current economic model? And why is it so dissatisfying and unfulfilling? Can we together create a system and a future where our purpose and contribution isn't as passive and debt-driven consumers, but as enlightened, critical, productive members of society? Come and join us for that panel with some world-renowned economists on Saturday at 6 p.m. And then our final two panels will be taking place on the final day of the conference, Sunday the 5th. The first one will be on culture, and we'll be holding postmodernism to scrutiny. And we'll be asking, what is the consequence of a world that believes there are no truths and absolutes? In a world that is rapidly claiming its monopoly on the league table of profession, in a world that is rapidly claiming its monopoly on the league table of oppression, how do we see beyond our social limitations to more universal characteristics to better ourselves and overcome the problems that we've inherited? How can our academia and literature create an empowering culture that doesn't create a dependency on the state, but instead empowers us with the courage to work in communities to drive change? That panel will be taking place at 3 p.m. BST on Sunday, the 5th of July, and then it will be followed shortly by our final panel of the conference, our final big question on sustainable rights and civics. And it will ask, what is the relationship currently on a global scale in 2020 between those who are governed and those who are governing? In the world right now, we live in a world right now where our relationships with governing institutions and indeed even one another is very transactional. While our notion of community is dissolving quite rapidly, so is our notion that we are citizens of a country and that we must serve it as it serves us. So how do we create a sustainable civics model that teaches us what our obligations are as human beings as much as it reminds us what our rights are? So that's the crux of the conference. It's worth me reassuring you that this conference may cause some discomfort. Lean into it. The main questions we're trying to ask are, to what extent do our existing narratives help us to promote sustainable narratives? And how do we change that if we need to? How do the current narratives, or rather the stories we tell ourselves, make us into flourishing and contributing spirited individual members of society? We are not here to romantically intellectualize. Here at Vichaar Manthan, we are prepared for those uncomfortable truths. We are prepared to uncover ideas that will shatter our current belief systems and challenge our approaches and initiate real change. Nothing at Vichaar Manthan is off limits. We will have the courage together to face harsh realities and adopt new ways of thinking for a more liberal, reasonable society where our systems can be confidently held to account of truth. As well as these 5 panel discussions, we have 9 fantastic fireside conversations with some world-renowned thought leaders. They'll be discussing everything from Trump to global order, to ethics and nationalism, infectious ideas, how they're created, cultivated, distributed. Be sure to check out vichaarmanthan.org/sustainable narratives for a full itinerary of the next 4 days. The integrity with which this conference has been put together by 25 volunteers over the last just 6 weeks, I hope shines through in the next 4 days. It is a testament to the hard work that we have over 5,000 delegates attending this conference from 10 countries across the world. And I hope that you will recognize and see that and support us for it. Please share with your friends and family. There's still time to register for each of our panel discussions and fireside conversations. Keep an eye on our social media channels. We have a live team working on responding to any queries that you have on social media. We're active on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Be sure to tag Vichaar Manthan and hashtag sustainable narratives to join the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we're a voluntary organization. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank those of you who have become well-wishers and pledged to support Vichaar Manthan. In helping and supporting our work, you are actively investing in ideas that matter, so thank you. I will now pass you over to Dr. Sachin Nandha to tell us a little bit about why Vichaar Manthan is so important and relevant today. Sachinji is the National Coordinator for Vichaar Manthan UK and CEO of the private equity firm Pillbox Capital. And over the last 6 weeks, he has been meticulously guiding each of the volunteers through this invigorating experience of putting together the world's largest sustainability conference of its kind. If I can promise you anything, it's that for the next 12 minutes, you are in very safe hands. Over to you, Sachinji.
Thank you so much, Vidhuji. Namaste to everybody who's watching from around the world. I am delighted to be opening the first ever Sustainable Narratives Conference that Vichaar Manthan, or VM for short, has ever arranged. This conference, I believe, has come at a pertinent time. Our planet is going through what can look like a tumultuous period in its history. On the one hand, we can say we've never had it so good. Humanity has never experienced such long living. Even in the poorest parts of the world, people are living longer. Infant mortality is down, death through starvation has never been so low, and recovery from disease has never been so high. Steven Pinker makes this argument as strongly as anyone. The world may not be a utopia, but it has never been better by any measure. This is one narrative. Then you have, and we have all been witnessing, all over the developed world, what is broadly called woke culture, where people must cling onto one identity or another, which itself finds expression through victimhood. Every group is pitted against another. One has made the other a victim of one kind or another, and a league table of oppression is created to see who is the biggest victim of them all. This is another narrative. Which is correct? Maybe one, maybe both, maybe none. Maybe a more nuanced question ought to be, which is closer to the truth? At Sustainable Narratives, we want to be exploring the stories we have been telling ourselves and each other, narratives which shape how we experience ourselves and the world in which we live. These stories shape the behavior of individuals and institutions alike. We want to examine the most prevalent stories of our time and put them on the dock in the light of sustainability. By sustainability, we at Vichaar Manthan mean those stories that take us closer to the truth. And it is as simple as that. Every narrative may have its limitations, but some narratives take us closer to reality than others. How do we differentiate between narratives that are sustainable and unsustainable? Narratives, we believe, must be reasonable, that is, able to stand up against scrutiny. Narratives must be explored freely, without restriction or fear of being attacked. Narratives must be enduring, that is, they must be time-tested, and narratives must enhance human flourishing. Those narratives that stand up to reason, increase liberty, are time-tested, and enhance human flourishing are the stories that we ought to live our lives through. To flourish is to have the capacity to adequately respond to the challenges life throws at us. Life is uncertain. To flourish means to be able to navigate uncertainty to reach the best possible outcomes. To have capacity means having the right skills to cope with uncertainty and the challenges of life, while at the same time having the character to cope with it. Mental resilience, something which one might say is severely lacking today. What the ancients may have called fortitude, a term much underused. Character includes things like courage, honor, honesty, determination, the ability to forgive, and to be equanimous. This is by no means an exhaustive list. When characters and skills come together, the individual can be said to have the capability to respond. And this is what leads to flourishing. So at Sustainable Narratives, we want to be reasonable. We want to be liberal. We want to hold up each story in the light of human flourishing. There will be no platforming or vilification of individuals if their narrative is counter to people's sensibilities. And there are no taboo topics. This is a conference for humanity, period. It is a conference to encompass the entire tapestry of human society and human behavior. At this time, it is quite right that those of us who believe that ideas are important and are worthy of investing in must do so in the light of sustainability. For ideas themselves to flourish, they need to marry 4 elements. Ideas cost money. Ideas need time. Ideas need people, and ideas need institutions. Only when all of these things come together does an idea truly become powerful and influential. Ideas that lack or lose any of these things will ultimately be superseded. It is the way of the world. At Sustainable Narratives Conference, we want to unashamedly engage money, time, people, and institutions, and to take on some of the sustainable ideas that emerge from the 5 panel discussions and 8 fireside conversations. And we want people to question the narratives which have thus far shaped our lives, which do not fare well in the light of sustainability, and have the courage to adopt new ideas and narratives. This is a conference for change and not just intellectualization. This is a conference that will hear new ideas, the limitations of existing ones, and ideas radical in nature and contrary to what may be popular. I am delighted to tell you that we will have the opportunity to listen to some of the sharpest minds of our times, discussing live and openly about some of the greatest challenges humanity faces. We have 22 expert witnesses talking with us over the next 4 days across 5 panel discussions and 8 one-on-one firesides. We have the likes of Shashi Tharoor speaking live from India on Sunday at 1 p.m. UK time about what the world might look like by 2050 and what role will India play in shaping our future. We have Professor Gad Sad talking to us from Montreal, Canada on Saturday night at 8:30 p.m. UK time. And we will discuss what he calls parasitic ideas which harm our notion of common sense. We have Suhag Shukla talking to us from New York tonight at 9 p.m. UK time on understanding Trump and the rise of nationalism in America. And if these were not enough, we have Kaushal Mehra from the Charvaka podcast, Abhijit Iyer Mitra, a defense and security expert, talking to us about the role of the state. And we have Drishti May, who will share her extraordinary story about how she left Islam. We have 5 panel discussions. The first is tonight, starting in the next few minutes, on sustainable governance, where we will be joined live by Ram Madhav, the man behind the rise of India's ruling political party, the BJP, which won a landslide victory in 2018 alongside another renowned expert, Professor Steve Tsang, chaired by Andy Bayley. The panel will discuss the most pertinent challenges facing our world from a governance perspective. Tomorrow, we will have world-leading scholars discussing the role of institutionalized religion over the next 3 decades. How will religion continue to influence humanity? Peter Groves from Oxford, Acharya Vidyabhashkar from Switzerland, and Emer Burke from Ireland will join Anil Asthana from Australia as they discuss if institutionalized religions have had their day. Then, on Saturday, I will be chairing a panel with 3 brilliant economists, Eric Lonagam, Dr. Jamie White from right here in London, and Harsh Gupta from India. We will be exploring the narratives which surround money, the deity that we all worship in some small or large way. We will explore narratives around inequality, poverty, and wealth and regulation. Then on Sunday, we have not one, but two panel discussions. The first on Sunday afternoon, I will chair, and I will be joined by Professor Lou Marinoff from New York, Professor Makran Paranjape from Mumbai, and the famous fiction writer Amrish Tripathi from London. We will be exploring the narratives surrounding postmodernism, a collection of ideas that have radically altered our perceptions and our sensibilities and our attitudes to ourselves and towards the other. The final panel will convene on Sunday evening to explore the narratives we tell ourselves about civics, the relationship between individuals in a society and the relationship the society has with those that govern it. Manoj Ladwa, founder of the media house India Inc. and iGlobal, will be chairing the panel with Dr. Anirudh Rajput from the Center for Sustainability in Luxembourg, will join Professor Lou Marinoff and Professor Matthew McManus from New York and Washington as they discuss issues around rights and obligations of a citizenry. This will be a conference, I hope, that will stir our intellects as well as our hearts. The full lineup is on our website. This is a conference that has been put together by some 25 volunteers who all have full-time jobs, families, and commitments just like the rest of us. This conference is a testament to their efforts, their commitment to ideas that are worth investing in. So, to all the Vichaar Manthan volunteers who have spent literally hundreds of hours putting this conference together, often working into the early hours, I salute you. I am also delighted to tell you that this conference is supported by the Earth Foundation and the Center for Sustainability. Furthermore, iGlobal, our media partner for this conference, is covering every discussion and every conversation. This conference gives hope, not just in content, but in intent, and the manner in which it has been put together. We have thousands of people registered for this conference, and hundreds will be viewing the various panels and conversations over the coming 4 days from around the world. We have registrants from all over the United Kingdom, the United States, India, the Middle East, and the Far East. I hope you enjoy the lineup and will continue to engage and support Vichaar Manthan henceforth. I want to thank you, and on behalf of the whole team, welcome to Sustainable Narratives.
Thank you, Sachin, for that very comprehensive guide through the next 4 days. So here's the plan for this evening. We're going to take a short break for about 5 minutes, and then we'll meet back here at exactly 6:30 on the dot for our first panel discussion on sustainable governance in a rapidly changing world. That will go on until 8 p.m, where we will then have another break for 1 hour before we meet back on YouTube, youtube.com/c/Vichaar Manthan, for our fireside conversation with Suhag Shukla, moderated by Vichaar Manthan's London coordinator, Sumit Sharma. If you have any questions over the next 5 or 6 minutes before we start the next panel, please do reach out to us on social media at Vichaar Manthan. We have a live team working on replying to any queries, so they'll get back to you straight away. So grab a hot drink, get comfortable, and we'll see you back here in 6 minutes. Namaste.
Namaste. It is my pleasure to welcome our many viewers, not only in Britain, but around the world, and to welcome our chair for tonight's Manthan, Andy Bayley. Andy is an associate lecturer at Loughborough University's Centre for Information Management. He has over 30 years of experience in leading operations and logistics functions in the global aerospace sector. His special interests include change management, strategic change, and creative problem solving. Tonight, he will be our guide as we explore sustainable governance in a changing world. As we have just heard, Vichaar Manthan, or VM for short, is a platform that engages in open dialogue with both game changers and renowned institutions. We examine the issues facing modern society through a Hindu civilizational lens. At Vichaar Manthan's Sustainable Narratives Conference, we want to explore the stories we have been telling ourselves as a society. Stories which shape how we experience ourselves and the world in which we live. These narratives shape the behavior of individuals and institutions alike. We want to examine the most prevalent stories of our time and put them on the dock in the light of sustainability. For more information or to invest in ideas that matter, please click the link in the video description below. Without further ado, I would like to hand you over to our chair, Andy.
I would like to thank Neeti for that introduction and also echo my own welcome. I suppose it's really good morning, good afternoon and good evening. We've got two excellent guest speakers for you tonight and also a very large audience. The last time I heard there were nearly 4,000 of you had registered and we will have a chance to input your questions, which I believe I'm told is the YouTube live chat function that we'll be taking questions on. In terms of defining the Manthan tonight, I started with having a look at the definition of the act of governing, and it came up with some very interesting words. There's such things as making and administering public policy in affairs of state, regulation, keeping under control actions and behaviours, political authority, influencing. But when we think about governance, and we're talking about sustainable governance here, we not only include the act of governing itself, but we need to think about the tools, the systems and the processes that are used as well. Of course, the challenge is, how do you govern in a truly rapidly changing and globalized technological world? The Western world is no longer the dominant force it was. The influence and power is moving to the East. And how can all these cultures come together? And hopefully tonight we can have a look at in a little bit more detail, maybe the issues that India and China might be able to provide us and show us some leadership. We've also got the challenges, the minor challenges of the internet, climate change, financial regulation, trade rules, nuclear proliferation, and also the impact of religion in influencing both political and organizational bodies. Nation states alone just can't deal with such global issues. And the issue is, how do we get collaboration? And it's not only collaboration between countries, but also companies and organizations as well, as those companies and organizations are increasingly having a wealth and influence that actually outstrips some of the smaller countries in the world. We're seeing the rise of nationalism as well, as voters feel disenfranchised and not really felt represented by the political ruling organizations. And this actually leads to more introspection rather than a feeling of desire to reach across borders. A local v global, centralized v decentralized, transparency to gain trust. These are the paradoxes we hopefully touch on tonight. We're also got to reflect on our political institutions and frameworks. You know, they were created by thinkers of the past, and some of them, these were created in the 19th and very early 20th centuries. So what are the frameworks that might provide sustainable governance for the future to cope with these paradoxes? To help us tackle these questions, we've got two excellent speakers. Ram Madhav, who is the National General Secretary of India's BJP party. Ram is widely known as the strategist behind the success of BJP in India's elections. And he's also a very keen advocate for India to take a more active foreign policy in Southeast Asia. He's director of a public think tank, India Foundation, which is based in New Delhi. Ram originally studied engineering and went on to get a postgraduate degree in political science. And he started his political career very early. He became a member of the RSS organization, volunteering in 1981. Over time, he's held several key positions in that organization, and he actually became their national spokesman for over 10 years. It was at this point in 2014 that he was seconded onto the BJP party and assigned the role of National General Secretary. He's also authored over 12 books and worked as a journalist on a number of publications. So a warm welcome to Ram.
Thank you.
One of his publications was called Uneasy Neighbours, India and China After 50 Years of the War. Now this leads nicely into our second guest tonight. And Professor Steve Tsang is a leading scholar in the politics, international relations and history of mainland China, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Steve is the director of the China Institute at SOAS. He joined them in 2016. And prior to that, he served as head of the School of Contemporary Chinese Studies and director of China Policy Institute at the University of Nottingham. And before that, he was a professorial fellow at St Antony's College, Oxford, where he served as Dean Director of the Asian Studies Centre. His research interests focus on really all things Chinese, foreign policy, China's rising military might, the relationships that China has with all the various countries around the world, and obviously the relationships between China and Taiwan and China and Hong Kong in particular. Steve is a frequent expert called on by the media, and he's appeared on such channels as Newsnight, BBC One News, Sky News, Channel 4 News, Voice of America, Channel News Asia, Al Jazeera and Russian Today. So we have some very excellent guest speakers for you all tonight. I'd like to perhaps open the Manthan by turning to Ram first, if we could, and say to Ram really that I'd be interested to hear what he thinks the top three governance challenges are facing the world, and also what role can India actually play, particularly over the next 30 years, in contributing towards the resolution of those three issues.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and namaskars to everybody. For me in India, this is good night time. We are close to midnight time here in India. Thank you for inviting me to share my views on a very important and very contemporarily relevant topic today. Before I give my 3 penny of wisdom, let me hope and pray that you are all safe now. We are in the pandemic times. You are all keeping well. You are all following the guidelines of the governments and the experts that we get from time to time, so that you will also be safe and you will keep your families and your neighbors and your neighborhoods and communities also safe. I would like to focus a little bit on the global governance experience in the last few decades. I think that is very important and very relevant for the topic that we are discussing today. The challenge to global governance comes today from the decay of the very institutions that were created for that purpose some 75 years ago. I'm talking about the United Nations, which was created 75 years ago. This year is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. It was created, it was basically a brainchild of Roosevelt during the Second World War time. He shared it first with Winston Churchill, who was in US at that time. But when the United Nations was created, Roosevelt was no longer alive. The charter of the founding of the UN was signed on 26th June of 1945. Harry Truman was the president at that time. He had made an important proclamation. Rather, he was very euphoric. He said, oh, what a great day this can be in the history of the mankind. In fact, he sincerely believed that countries in the world would put aside their differences in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end wars. This was what Truman had said on that day. After 5 years in 1950, he elaborates on the purpose of the United Nations. I quote, this was Truman speaking in 1950. The United Nations represents the idea of a universal morality, superior to the interests of individual nations. Its foundation does not rest upon power or privilege. It rests upon faith. They rest upon the faith of men in human values, upon the belief that men in every land hold the same high ideals and strive toward the same goals for peace and justice. Now, 75 years down the line, when you listen to those, when you hear that statement, it sounds like a dream statement coming from some other world. The UN became almost everything that Truman did not want it to become. In the process, of course, it has lost its sheen and relevance. So my emphasis in my initial comments would be that global governance model needs to be thought of totally, completely afresh. The ideals and institutions have to be new. They should represent the 21st century reality. Because the institutions of global governance that were created in the middle of the last century, they do not represent the new global power order anymore. The global power axis has shifted away from the Pacific Atlantic of the last century. It has moved to Indo-Pacific today. Yet look at the UN. It is still dominated by the Western powers. 4 out of the 5 permanent members are from the Western Hemisphere. The global powerhouse today is the eastern part of our globe. But only one country from the east, namely China, is represented in the permanent membership in the United Nations. When the UN was created, the mission statement said that freedom from wars and striving for peace were the driving force. That was the driving force behind creation of the United Nations in the last century. Towards that end, what have they done? They created, they visualized that a few powerful countries will have a veto power. They will be more than equal. They will be responsible for, striving for peace and ensuring that there are no wars. But the world has transformed since then. From the lofty ideals of the United Nations, the beginning 75 years ago, to Cold War bipolarity. From Cold War bipolarity to ambitions of unipolarity. Recall end of the history statements. from there to a facade of multipolarity. I'm calling it a facade consciously. And finally today, where we have entered is a heteropolar world. Parag Khanna has described it as heteropolar world. You have states today, and you have non-state actors like multinational corporations, religious groups, NGOs, terrorist groups. All have their own spheres of influence. No, none of them respect except the states. No other agency respects national boundaries. So you are living in a totally different heteropolar world order today. This new world order calls for new institutions and also a new agenda. These two are my important 2 points for a country aspiring to become, today look at what is happening. A country which just 3 decades ago, when Soviet Union had collapsed, it was aspiring to become the lone pole in the world. I'm talking about the United States. The President of United States, President Donald Trump, standing in the United Nations General Assembly last year, has declared that 21st century world does not belong to globalists, it belongs to patriots. Today, US is shying away from any great global role. On the other hand, China under President Xi Jinping aspires to become a middle kingdom again. Yet the COVID and the allied issues have certainly dented its image, affected its standing in the world. In such a scenario, the new institutions that emerge in the post-COVID world order should offer a greater say for countries. I can use the word middle powers, or I can say countries in the Indo-Pacific region like India. The 20th century global agenda items like security alliances, multilateral trade and commerce arrangements, etc., some of which Andy has referred to. They are all important. I'm not denying their importance. But they have to, and they are going to take a back seat, and new agenda items like climate change, environmental issues, universal health care, technologies of new and frontier technologies, and most importantly, a rule-based world order. These kind of new agenda items are going to come in the forefront on the high table of the global governance. I think India has a very important role to play in this emerging new global order, where new countries will come into the forefront, new institutions will be created, will be built, will be constructed, and new agenda items will occupy the space on the high table of global governance. And I think I will stop here. I will go deeper into India's role, maybe in my concluding comments. Thank you for this opportunity.
I'd just like to come back at you very, very quickly, if I could, Ram. And I apologize for my question, because it's coming from a very Western-centric individual here. You talked about India taking a lead in this. Does it really have the experience and ability to do that in the sort of environment we discussed, do you believe?
The issues that will dominate the global discourse in the post-COVID world, like you also mentioned about climate change issues, environmental issues. You know, India is already a leader in those areas. And in these issues, India's wisdom, I can tell you, is not contemporary. It's a very ancient wisdom. How do you look at the environment? How do you look at the entire issue of ecological balance? this is something that Indians learn right from their childhood. It is a wisdom that they have inherited right from the 5,000-year-old history of its Vedas, its ancient scriptures and all that. From there to the most contemporary issue of technology, whether it is artificial intelligence or for that matter, robotics, right up to that, India is definitely an important player. You know, in technology, of course, you go to any global technological giant, majority of the people you find are those who eat curry and roti. They are all Indians. So whether we have experience or not, I would say yes, in the new global order, maybe in the old global order where security issues dominated the world, probably we lagged behind. But today, in the emerging new order, certainly India has a lot to contribute. I think I will talk more about it during the Q&A or maybe towards the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ram. I'd like now, if possible, excuse me, if I could turn to Steve. And really, Steve, I'd like to put the question to you. You know, China offers a very different perspective on governance compared to the West or compared to India even. And how will China's one-party system actually fare over the next 30 years? And, you know, is liberalism going to appear at all, do you think?
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and for the opportunity to address you. I think before I answer your questions, and Andy, in terms of where China is going to be in the next 30 years and whether it's going to be moving in the direction of democratization, I want us to highlight that we are paying so much attention to China because China is a rising power. It's being seen as the second superpower, potentially going to challenge the first superpower, the only superpower. And we are also paying so much attention to China as an alternative model because the Western democracies have, in the last 10, 15 years, done so poorly. We have the global financial crisis, which really put paid to the kind of idea that was in place at the end of the Cold War, where there was all this hubris of end of history and democracies have won and things are all going to be going in one direction. And of course, we just are still in the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, in the current pandemic, the Western democracies have done very poorly. And we have done very poorly simply by us being very complacent and not being very level-headed in dealing with the challenges we faced. And in comparison here, China has done remarkably well. Now, okay, China did very badly at the beginning with the start of the pandemic, and in January and in February, they were really in serious trouble. So much so that there were a kind of not quite crisis, but there was a serious concern within the leadership in terms of its own credibility in the country. But China was the first in, first out. China has since managed it so well. In comparison, the Chinese have impressed the world as being handling it better than the Western democracies have managed to. I think all these do matter. And we also have a leader in China who is not hesitant to assert China's achievements. He, Xi Jinping, wants to show the world that yes, China is here, China is a great force for all kinds of wonderful things, and all these are thanks to the leadership of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. And we have therefore a kind of bandwagon effect in how we look at China, this new rising power delivering so much while the Western democracies are failing. And everybody therefore are looking at China. Maybe China will offer an alternative and a better way of dealing with our problems or issues of governance. now I'm moving to address the question you raised, but I want to address it in terms of what do we actually mean when we talk about sustainable governance. And I would say that when we are looking at sustainable governance, we are looking at, in fact, two other qualities which are unspoken but implicitly implied. One is that it is good. The second is that it's efficient. We expect a sustainable governance is something that is good, efficient, and sustainable. Then let's here address the three different key qualities here. Is China a force for good? I think that will have to be the standard, rather than whether it is good for China and that sort of thing. Whether it's good for the world. Is China a force for good for the world? Here, if we are being very honest and direct, I would have to say that the focus of Chinese foreign policy is to make the world safe for authoritarianism. A world that is safe for authoritarianism is a world that is safe for the Communist Party of China in China. And that is the first and foremost concern of the Chinese leadership under the Communist Party before Xi Jinping and continue under Xi Jinping. If anything, it goes in that direction even more under Xi Jinping than before. But that doesn't change. Is a world that is safe for authoritarianism a good world? Is that a world for the good of the human race? I have a bit of doubt on that. I'm a liberal Democrat. I believe in democracy. I believe in human rights. A world good for authoritarianism is not a world that is good for people who believe in what I believe in. Is China efficient? Yes. In the short term, China is very, very efficient. I think the COVID-19 case is a wonderful case in point. If we look at how the building of infrastructures in China, it beats practically everybody and anybody. Even if I may say so, the Japanese and the Germans might concede the place to China in the last 30 years or so. Yes, but isn't that actually something that we know in human history? East, West, North, South anyway? An effective and efficient dictatorship is always efficient in the short term. The issue is, will that efficiency be sustained? Can it be sustained? Can it last beyond the leadership who actually is delivering it? Now, when that leadership is not a collective leadership, but the leader of one, a strong man, call that whatever you like, king, emperor, party general secretary, president, doesn't matter. But if it's all up to one person, then it's up to that person getting things right. He gets it wrong, things go pear-shaped. And the big change Xi Jinping has introduced since he became leader in China in 2012 is that he's changed the Communist Party top echelon from a collective leadership to making himself a strong man since the 19th Party Congress in 2017. Now it's all up to Xi Jinping. That's why when things were getting a bit rather sticky at the start of the pandemic at the end of January and early February, we actually had a bit of a problem in China in terms of the credibility and the legitimacy of the party state. So it's not all that guarantee long-term efficiency. Now, sustainability is that very, very issue. With Xi Jinping having made himself leader for life, well, then we have an issue of it probably may not sustain itself beyond Xi Jinping. We also have to deal with the perennial issues that history has shown us. a very able, bright, efficient, and effective leader, king, emperor, dictator, whatever, often does not manage to deliver the same level of efficiency and effectiveness at the later stage of one's rule. What is there to believe that Xi Jinping will not fall into that same issue and problem? Now, let me also say that, address the question you raised about whether China will democratize or not. A government that is dedicated to make the world safe for authoritarianism is a government that is fundamentally anti-democratic. I mean, that is the Communist Party of China. It is not undemocratic. It is not a-democratic. It is anti-democratic. For a system that is undemocratic, it can change. It can democratize. A system that is anti-democratic will not do so because it goes against everything that it represents. Let me sort of very quickly move on and say that China is a country that is making enormous impact on the world already. And I think we are going to see more of that impact being made. But we shouldn't confuse that with whether that will deliver good, efficient, and sustainable governance for the world in the long term. China is a rising superpower, therefore it already has a very large footprint across the board. That's why it's often being mentioned. Everybody talks about China these days. The second one is that China is already reshaping major UN agencies. We have seen how the WHO functioned in the midst of the pandemic, and there are indications of rather interesting effectiveness of Chinese engagement with WHO. We have seen how the Human Rights Council at the UN changed from when it was previously the Commission for Human Rights. From the time when China was the subject for human rights abuse to now, China is usually not being mentioned. We are also looking at impact like the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, multi-country, enormous infrastructural projects. Whether you like it or not, it is making a very significant impact. We are also looking at what's happening in Hong Kong right now, the world's third most important global financial center. It is in the midst of being changed into something that a lot of people will have problems with. And we are looking also at what happens in Xinjiang, where 1 out of every 10, or potentially even more, of its Muslim minority, called the Uyghurs, are in places that the Chinese government call re-education centers, that by other definitions would be called concentration camps, where the fertility of their females are being systematically restricted, which under the kind of definition the UN used for genocide would fit that description. So we're seeing all this happening. This is a very big, important country that is going to have huge impact on how we govern ourselves as a global community. But I cannot say that it is moving that world in a direction that is good for humanities. And I will just end here by highlighting one thing, system contrast. In a system like China's, a hard authoritarian system, the leader has to get policies right all the time to sustain good governance. Democracy is a system designed for mediocres. It's a system that does not usually support genius to be particularly great. But it's a system that can also accommodate leaders who are incredibly incompetent and irresponsible. And most of the time, it only needs very mediocre people running it to keep it going pretty well. And that, to me, is a system that is most likely to be a sustainable, to be able to deliver sustainable governance. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd just like to put to you, if I could, with the very, very honest appraisal you've given us there, in your opinion then, how should the West and India actually approach China, to try and bring them in more into the discussion? Or do you think it's totally impossible?
I think we must engage China. I think the idea of treating China as an enemy is the wrong ways to do it. Treat any country as the enemy, that country will be your enemy. But engage with eyes wide open, engage on the basis that we hold tight to our value and not only look at the bank account. China remains a Leninist political system. And one of the key legacy of Leninism is what Lenin taught. And Lenin said famously that the capitalists will sell you the rope that you intend to hang them with. And we should not make that mistake. But it doesn't mean we do not do business with it.
Thank you very much, Stephen. A couple of things there. I'd just like to follow through the theme, if I may, and ask Ram, how should China approach India? What would be the things that might break a deadlock, if that is possible?
A very, very good question, Andy. India-China relations have seen a number of ups and downs in the last 5-6 decades post the most traumatic 1962 war. For 2 decades, we did not talk with each other. We started talking subsequently. Both sides have made efforts to create a strong bonding. Through that process, we built a strong trade relationship between our two countries. Today, I'm sure you all know that the bilateral trade between India and China is to the tune of about $100 billion, which is a substantially big trade relationship between our two countries. So trade is one way of bringing countries closer to each other. They can engage with each other, talk to each other. But I must be honest here that China is more than just a country. It is a different kind of creature. The thinking of the leadership, the strategy, the objectives, these have to be very carefully understood by countries which want to do business with that country. It's not like you are doing business with any other country. You know, in India, we sometimes refer to Sun Tzu's doctrine of the art of war, in which he categorically says the art of war is an art in deception. Deception as the art in war. Maybe Sun Tzu, he is a 2 millennia old scholar, philosopher. Whether he's relevant or not is something that we can all debate. But as a country that has experienced the kind of relationship with China, we come to the conclusion that we are not dealing with any other neighbor. Like, you know, India has many neighbors, but China is a different kind of neighbor. So while India's efforts will certainly be to have good relations with China, we continue to try and have good relations with our northern neighbor, but India has to be, I mean, if I were to borrow Mr. Steve's words, we have to do it with our eyes wide open, which we do today. We do deal at the diplomatic level, we talk to them, but we take a strong position, strong posturing when it comes to securing certain economic or strategic interests of the country. I think from India's experience, that is the way to go about. Until, of course, one rider I will add an end. Until, of course, the Leninist or Stalinist, if I were to go by the new description of the American leadership about the Chinese leadership, it is Stalinist. It is no longer Leninist also. So Marxist, Leninist or Marxist, Stalinist leadership, if it undergoes a change, and if there is a systemic change in China, then probably things will be different. But right now, we have our own experience of dealing with this neighbor.
Thank you, Ram. We've got some questions coming in from the audience. Before I turn to those, I'd just like very, very quickly to give both Steve and Ram the opportunity. One of the questions that struck me was that we've talked a bit about frameworks, and Stephen's mentioned the fact that it needs to be both good, efficient, and sustainable. So, Stephen, do you see, or have you come across anywhere something in the world, in a corporation, an organization, that might be classed as a model that could be looked at, that could take these issues forward, that we could actually use to start the collaboration?
Is there models of genuine good governance? I think we shouldn't actually set the bar too high. I mean, the definition that I like the best about democracy is the one that Churchill provided. Democracy is a terrible system. I think he said it's actually the worst system, with the exception of the rest. If we are looking at countries in the world or polities in the world which have been governing themselves in ways which are fairly decent, I mean, I think they do exist. Regrettably, at the moment, I am unable to suggest that the United Kingdom is right up there. I think there was a time that I would have not hesitated to do so, but not at the moment. But at the moment, I would say actually New Zealand doesn't look so bad. And some place that we've always forgotten is Taiwan. Taiwan really doesn't look so bad. It's doing very well. And Taiwan is a place that is worth a lot of attention, because whatever people in Taiwan say about what they would like to be and how they would like to be identified, it is a cynic culture. It is populated by people of Chinese descent. Arguably, in Taiwan, they kept to the Chinese tradition far more closely and far better than this is happening on the mainland of China itself. It is a fantastic example to show that Chinese are perfectly capable of running a democracy and running it very, very well indeed.
Thank you, Steve. Just turning to Ram then, same question really. Have you come across, do you see any frameworks, any models anywhere in the world that you think people might be able to adopt to help us through these issues?
Yes, certainly. There are many countries that offer many wonderful examples of governance, models of governance. Now, for example, take the case of Singapore, a tiny country, city-state, but the way they have transformed that utterly poor country in 5 decades to one of the leading centers of commerce and trade and financial activity is a great example of how a determined leadership can really transform through good governance a country from rags to riches. Several such examples, each number of countries can offer different such good examples. I agree that democracies sometimes present a lousy picture, but we should not forget that the alternative to democracy is authoritarianism and dictatorship. For us, any time, a democracy with a million faults, million shortcomings is okay from a dictatorship that looks, that allows you all the riches, except that if you have a dog, it's not even allowed to bark. Not that kind of a system. So at any time, I mean, why I'm saying this is not to contest Steve's observations. I fully respect his views, but of late, I see a lot of literature coming out, contesting democratic models, saying that democracies are anti-freedom, democracies are anti-people. These are the kind of literature that is coming out. I somehow feel that we have to look at it a little more carefully. There is no doubt democracies have to improve, democracies have to become better, but the alternative to democracies today is authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, which are not really good for the larger good of the mankind. I just have to give you one more example to add to the discussion here. Take the case of the ASEAN group of nations. Remember, not all 10 countries are democracies. There are different models of governance, but they came together on a common agenda, offering an example to the world that this can be a model. I mean, this is a tiny 21st century United Nations model in Indo-Pacific. In fact, we believe that ASEAN is the peg to the entire Indo-Pacific for coming together. ASEAN, in which Singapore is there, quasi-democracy. Cambodia is there. Indonesia is there. Malaysia is there. Philippines is there. Vietnam is there. So a model that the ASEAN group of nations has presented can be a good model for the entire world to learn from and emulate for the 21st century when you think of building new institutions.
Thank you very much, Ram. I'd like to turn to some of the questions that are coming in, and just to remind our audience as well that you can actually input your questions via the YouTube live chat function. So please keep those questions coming in. And one here, particularly from Vipasha, he says, Steve just quoted Churchill in saying democracy is terrible with the exception of the rest. What do the speakers think is the best governance system then in the light of sustainability? Maybe if I could go to Steve first and then bring Ram in a little bit later after Steve has talked.
I hope that we will come up with a better systems than democracy. And I hope and believe that at some stage, human race will come up with something better than that. But at the moment, we have not yet come up with any system which is better. I think, to me, when we are looking at something that is sustainable, and that has to be something that deliver on balance more good than bad to the humankind, we are not only looking at efficiency, we are also looking at the minimization of abuse and the scope for human dignity to be upheld and respected. And this, I think, are very important factors. And that is the reason why I picked the two countries. I picked New Zealand and Taiwan as the examples of what I think we should be looking at. I mean, these are places where rights of minorities, whether we are talking about ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or gender minorities, are being treated very well. I mean, one is a country of the Anglo-Saxon heritage. The other is of an Asian heritage. And they both can deliver that and provide systems that enable the human individual to find fulfillment. If it means the overall development is a bit slower, if it means the standard of living is a bit lower, I'm okay with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And if we could cut back to Ram, the same question really. You know, what is the best government system then in the light of sustainability?
See, the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, was asked the same question as to why he opted for democracy when India became independent. His answer was, see, the democracy is the second best form of government. So naturally, the questioner asked the next question, then what is the best form? Nehru's reply was yet to be invented. We have the best available form of governance in democracies. India is again a shining example of it. Look, in our 73 years of our independent existence, except for 2 years under Madam Indira Gandhi's emergency dictatorship, except for those 2 years, India has had a vibrant democracy for 70 years. People are happy. At the drop of the hat, we change governments. People who believe that they are permanent, nobody can defeat them, they will bite the dust in the elections that come next. So we have a vibrant society, we have a vibrant democracy. Democracies, no doubt, need improvement, but it is a process. Look at different countries in the world, including China. They claim to be a democracy. Rule of the people, as Herodotus said, is what we understand as democracy, but there are shades of democracies. I mentioned to you, Singapore. Is it a full democracy? People can contest. Taiwan is a liberal democracy. There are liberal democracies, there are illiberal democracies. There are democracies, there are undemocracies. There are democracies, but they are liberal but undemocratic. These phrases are not my own. I have not invented these phrases. Illiberal democracy is a phrase invented by Fareed Zakaria. And liberal democracy is a phrase invented by Yasha Monk. You have shades of democracies. Why we have those shades is, with all their faults, we all believe that they are the best available models. Large part of the world believes that way. Having said it, there is a democracy deficit that is growing in the world today. Slowly, democracies are shrinking and other forms are growing. Yeah, that is also a challenge for us.
Thank you very much, Ram. Before we go over to the full Q&A, I think perhaps it might be worthwhile just pulling together some thoughts that we've talked very much about the countries and the frameworks and the models that the countries have. I was doing a bit of research for this this particular conference, and one of the things that shocked me slightly was when I looked at the economic entity league table. So this is a league table based on purely on wealth and includes both countries, includes companies and organizations as well in there. It was just over 50% of the people in the top 100 were actually companies or organizations that you wouldn't class as countries. So if we're going to get a collaboration going, how do we square this circle where we've not only talked a little bit today about the countries coming together, how do you bring, or should you bring, these large economic, very, very influential companies to the table as well? Maybe if I could start with Steve, and then we can come back to Ram to get his views.
I think you're right, Andy. I think we do have to engage with the major multinationals and try to make sure that they are pulling their weight as well and pulling in the right direction. The world is never a static place. Human history is always changing. It's a very dynamic process. We are now dealing with, as you quite rightly say, some major companies which have economies which are substantially bigger than lower medium-sized countries. And therefore, they really are major forces in their own right. We have been in the last 20, 30 years putting more emphasis on global corporate social responsibility. We should be focusing a lot more on them. We should be engaging with companies like Google, which says that its motto is "Don't do evil." That we have to hold it to its own motto, that it does not do something that is evil, because companies like Google has such power and such penetration, and it cannot be just Google. It is we have to try to engage with them and try to generate enough of commercial and social pressure that the major multinationals like Google's and Facebook's and Huawei's and Shell and BP have to take on their corporate social responsibilities, and where they don't, we collectively, by our actions, punish them, so that they feel that they have an incentive to do so. I don't think we should leave that to governments of the world to do that. I think we should be doing that as members of the global community. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Ram, over to you.
Yes, when I talked about heteropolarity during my initial comments, this is precisely what I meant. In the 21st century, it's not just the states which run the global affairs. You have many other poles. That is why it's not even multipolarity as we understand, in the sense that many states emerging as poles. It is a number of non-state agencies. You referred to multinational corporations, the behemoths, the financial behemoths. Not just them, you have religious organizations which have their sway all over. And you have certain NGOs. They are non-governmental organizations. They are supposed to be human rights organizations or charity organizations, but their influence and power is far and wide. You have terrorist groups that have transnational appeal and influence. So we are living in a heteropolar type of world situation. This is here that we have to understand what kind of new institutions we have to build, because the last global institutions that we built some 75 years ago were basically in a scenario where only nations, that too the Western nations, European and American leadership, they came together to decide about the future of the mankind, future of the world. But today there are too many players. So one thing that I would say, that while I say that democracy is the best available form of governance for individual countries, don't try to export or wage wars in the name of exporting it to other countries. Leave the other countries to their own, allow them to choose their own models. What we need to do is, rather than trying to export your model to other countries through wars and through other conflicts, you build a world order which is rules-based. When I say rules-based, it's not just for the countries alone, but also the corporations, but also all those who work across nations. We all have to follow certain rules, certain guidelines. You may be a democracy, you may be a semi-dictatorship, you may be a quasi-democracy, but you all have to, you may be a corporation, you may be an NGO, but we all have to stick to certain rules. That rule-based world order is what should be the basis on which we build new institutions for the 21st century.
Thank you, Ram. I'm conscious of the time now, and I'm conscious there are some questions coming in. So I'd like to turn to the first question. And this is from David Woods, who's the chair of the London Futurists. And David asks, is the essence of democracy that everybody has a single vote, or is there more to it? is it open to ideas and participation from all citizens beyond mere voting and a wide separation of powers? We're with Ram at the moment. If Ram, you could pick that up, then I'll also go back to Steve in a minute just to get his views as well.
Democracy, from the time of the Greek philosophers who spoke about it, is loosely understood as the rule of the people. No, it took different shapes in different countries. That is why I said you have illiberal democracies at one end to liberal undemocracies at the other end, where democratic rights are limited, but you have all other freedoms, all other liberties. You can enjoy life, you can have all the goods in life. So there are a range of democracies in the world. The democracy that the question that was raised about whether it is limited to just casting their vote once in 5 years, that is not exactly the model in all the countries. There are different models in other countries where you can you can stall an act being passed, a legislation being passed. There are certain democracies which do not allow that. So there are different types of experiences in the world. I can speak for my country, India. Here, we have a robust democracy right up to grassroots. It's not about just electing a national government. This right to elect its own leaders right up to the village has been made available to people of India. So a person in India elects his local government in his village and also his national government. In the process, he is electing 5 tier governments. At 5 levels, he is electing his governments. So here he is the person who is choosing his master. Oh, it's a very effective model that we have in India. Although here again the point is he is only casting his vote, but he is having so much power to elect his government, and in 3 years to 5 years time, he has the power to pull it down. Thank you.
Thank you. If we could turn to Steve and Steve's view on that question.
My starting point is, I guess, where Lord Acton started, which is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that is a reality of human life wherever we are. Democracy, therefore, is not so much an end itself. It's not so much about a system. I think democracy is about protecting a way of life where the humans can flourish, the individuals can be respected and therefore developed. We need a democratic electoral cycle to minimize the scope of abuse and therefore ensure that the protections of the rights of individuals and the scope for individuals to develop can be least damaged. And therefore, to me, there is an illiberal democracy is not a democracy. With all due respect, Ram, I think a democracy will have to be something that respects the liberal principles. It has to respect human rights. It will have to work with the rule of law. A democracy without rule of law is not a real democracy.
Thank you, Steve. Whilst you're on screen, a question from Sapna. Steve suggested that liberal democracy is the only sustainable mode of governance. And Sapna's question really is about how do we protect liberal democracy then against the rise of global populism in the coming years? And then once Stephen's put his thoughts on that, I'll move to Ram with the same question.
Well, clearly excellent questions, because liberal democracies have not been doing very well in confronting populism so far. But perhaps COVID-19 is the kind of challenge which is happening, and it's the sort of things that will happen periodically, which would push all systems to its limits and be tested. And I suspect that in the end, liberal democracy will come out better by putting out the populists. And we have the mechanism to do so, whereas the alternative systems do not actually provide us the scope to peacefully remove populists who have managed to secure a mandate by the electoral process or by other means. I think it's a bit of a, to me, misunderstandings to see populism as something that only happens in democracy. I think you can have populism in non-democracies as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Over to Ram with the same question.
Okay, I have a slight disagreement over this whole argument of populism. You know, this is a very convenient argument for many. Until 2016, America was very liberal, very democratic. It was a liberal democracy. But the moment there was a different kind of popular verdict, that liberal democracy suddenly becomes populist. The leader suddenly becomes a populist leader, not popular. No, this is a very convenient argument. I would feel that this is largely a defeatist argument that we make. I humbly submit that there is no definition of liberal democracy that all of us agree. There are different liberal democracies, and liberal democracies overnight become illiberal democracies just because a ruler changes, a government changes. That is the wise opinion that I hear from many intellectuals. Every 4 years in America, depending upon who is the president, that country becomes either liberal or illiberal. So, democracy is one idea that defies any universally accepted definition. First of all, we have to agree. So when we conclude that liberal democracy, I don't agree, or illiberal democracy, I don't agree, there is no common agreement about the definition of democracy in the entire world. Having said it, this whole argument about populism is a very recent postmodernist argument about certain strong leaders that are emerging in different democratic countries in the world. It is a phase, you must remember. The democracies pass through different phases. Today's phase in the world for democracies is to throw up strong leaders. You accept that the democratic system is throwing up strong leaders. Democracies have inherent power to control, correct if there is anything going wrong in their countries. Have faith in that system rather than suddenly waking up and dismissing those leaders as populist, those democracies as illiberal. This is the tendency that we have to guard against, I believe. I mean, you may have reservations over a particular leader and his tendency or in his actions. But to conclude that every leader, a strong leader that is emerging out of a democratic process is, he will become populist because Europe had an experience in 1930s of some democratically elected leaders, rising to become dictators. So in 2020 also it will be the same. I think that is not the right way to look at it. The world has progressed, and today we have strong leaders. That is the time in which we are living.
Thank you, Ram. If you could stay on the line, Ram. We've got an interesting question here, which is moving more into the corporate world, but very relevant to what we're talking about. This is a question from Harsh, and they say, considering the vulnerabilities that have been exposed in the global supply chains due to COVID-19, how can we reimagine global supply chains in the coming years? And should we continue to pursue globalization?
Okay. While this is a very important challenge that we are all facing, the breaking down of the global supply chains, let me tell you, India is a miniature world. We are facing a massive challenge of the collapse of local supply chains. India being a big country with 600 million strong middle class market, with 1.3 billion population. It's a massive market. We are struggling to restore our own domestic supply chains. It's a challenge that we are all facing. But coming to that important question of what is the future of globalization? Globalization will suffer, will face tough questions, not because of the collapse of the supply chains today due to this pandemic. Of course, this pandemic has definitely disrupted the supply chains. But globalization is suffering from a number of anomalies in the last 20 years. So much so that people are writing obituary for globalization today. In fact, they are seeing pandemic as a blessing in disguise. I mean, it is helping us, end this whole tamasha of globalization. That is because of certain very inherent defects. Again, I will go back to my favorite first point, that even for globalization to survive, to come back into currency, it has to have greater accommodation of the Eastern world in its decision-making process, which doesn't happen today.
Thank you, Ram. If we could go over to Steve now, and similar question to Steve. And I'd actually put a further question in on Steve as well, is that China, I would presume, is less dependent on global supply chains. Is that correct?
Right, very good questions. I think the global supply chain is going to change after the pandemic. It's not so much about what the pandemic is doing, it's about how countries have responded to the pandemic. And the pandemic is the first time that when we have this current stage, globalization, something that went beyond any previous attempts at globalization before. And in this test, we found that some countries in the global supply chain have not been particularly reliable. And because of that unreliability, I think rather than the wider politics of it, which is going to get key players in the building up the global supply chain to think about something that is perhaps more reliable on certain critical supplies. The first lot would, of course, be about PPE and pharmaceuticals, but I suspect that we're going to see beyond that being affected. Now, I don't see globalization being pushed to an end. I think globalization has brought about so much to the human race that I don't see us abandoning it, but I see that we will be making changes and adjustments, realizing that a unrestricted globalization does have its limitations, and therefore some adjustments will need to be made. Now, is China less susceptible to problems of this global supply chain? I should think not. I mean, the Chinese economy is enormous. It's the second largest in the world, and it's got the, I think maybe not quite the largest population any longer. I think India might have got that honor now, but it's pretty close to each other anyway. But with the Chinese economy substantially bigger than the Indian one, so the Chinese economy is in a substantially better place to deal with all these problems. But it is a very key part of the global supply chain. So I don't see it being able to completely decouple itself from the rest, even though I, at my introductory remarks, did say that the Chinese, in fact, were preparing for some kind of decoupling with the United States economy even before Trump became leader in the United States. But that is not something which I think can be done easily. And I don't think the Chinese are sufficiently well protected for them to push in that direction either. But changes are coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Andy,
Steve, you can stay on the line. A question here from Kishan. If supranational institutions are no longer effective, as Ram was talking about, then what role does the EU have to play in the global order? in the next few decades?
Oh, that is for me.
Well, we can start with you, Ram. We can go with that one and we go back to Steve on it.
Okay, just one sentence about China and its place in the global supply chains. I hope our audience know that of the 20 busiest ports in the world, 11 happen to be in China. So they are very important in global, supply chains. What will happen post the pandemic is for one to watch and see.
A good point.
As far as the European Union is concerned, I think I refrain from making any comment because probably somebody in Europe should respond to it.
Let's see what Steve has to say on the matter.
Whether the EU will be able to come through the pandemic completely unscathed, I think is a question that should be asked. On the assumption that the EU will come through the pandemic well, then it will be a lot stronger. And a EU that managed to patch up all the problems that it has, particularly in the way how it did not respond so well to the early stage of the pandemic, will be a EU that has worked out a lot more of the problems of how to accommodate with each other and accept that there will have to be an element of working for the common good.
Okay.
The really important thing about the European project is the willingness to share sovereignty and to share the good resources for the common good. Now, if that happens, then I will see that EU being in a rather good place to push itself again as a good example of what the world can be like. And I will see that as a positive force. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I've got a question here from Lavi Lakhani, and it's specifically for Ram. And Ravi says, if the UN has lost its shield, as Ram said earlier on, what international institutions should replace it? Or how can its structure be adapted to bring it greater relevance in today's international order? Over to you, Ram.
I think I have partly answered that question when I said that the new institutions are rather a modified UN for the 21st century should give greater scope, greater space, and greater importance to countries in the most happening region in the world today, namely the Indo-Pacific region, our part of the world. India is an important country in this region, important power in this region. ASEAN group of countries are an important power in this region. Japan is an important power. Australia is an important power. These countries have to have greater say in the affairs of any new arrangement that we will make in the 21st century, or any improvements that we try to make to the existing the institution of the United Nations today. I must mention here that the relevance or the acceptability of the UN is shrinking, is the view of the UN leadership itself. If you listen to what the Secretary General has to say on the occasion of this 75th anniversary of the United Nations, he himself feels that probably there is an urgent need for greater reform in the United Nations structure, this overblown bureaucracy, the bureaucratic way of its functioning, the controls, the vetoes, all these things have to be completely, reviewed.
I'm just conscious of time here, and what I would like to do is give both our speakers a chance to have some closing remarks from them. So what I'd like to do, while Ram's perhaps on the screen, as a final question, 3 minutes summary if you could, Ram, What kind of leadership will India provide to the world over the coming 30 years as a final summary?
Thank you, Andy. I mentioned that in the 21st century, the global power axis has shifted to India's neighborhood in the Indian Ocean or Indo-Pacific region. Indian Ocean has today, am I lost? Okay. Indian Ocean has today emerged as, of course, it's a lifeline for India, but as a very important central region, central ocean for our entire region. And India's centrality to Indian Ocean is an undeniable reality. Similarly, I would say the centrality of the Indo-Pacific to the global geopolitics also cannot be understated anymore. And in that, the centrality of the ASEAN powers or India, countries like it, also needs to be acknowledged. In the emerging new world order, India has ambition. I'm using this word with all responsibility. We have an ambition to rise as an influential and responsible global power. India is home to India is the world's largest democracy and successful democracy. And we are home to ancient wisdom of the Vedas, the knowledge systems from time immemorial. Indian knowledge systems have always championed the contemporary issues that we face today, like the environmental issues, the climate issues, the relationship between man and the creation, man and the universe, issues of healthcare, what is holistic living all about. So in a pandemic-stricken world, in a COVID-stricken world today, we need to urgently relook at all these issues. Protection of the environment, climate change issues. How do we manage the global health care? When I say global health care, we are not just talking about disease management. How do you address the viruses, pandemics that come and attack the humanity from time to time? Not only about disease management, but about the holistic living. In these areas, India has a lot to contribute to the world. We are already championing the climate change issues. Prime Minister Modi is a leader who has taken it upon himself, and India is proud to have the first United Nations organization headquarters situated in Gurugram near Delhi of the World International Solar Alliance. The renewable energy area, the UN headquarters is in India. India is championing these causes.
Right, thank you very much, Ram. I'm going to close you down there, if I may, because we need to give Steve a chance for him to answer a question as well. But thank you very much for that. Steve, if I could turn to you for a chance for your final remarks here. What's the future of the Chinese state over the next 30 years?
Very good questions, Andy. Predicting the future of a country 30 years forward is always extremely haphazard. I mean, particularly if we are looking at a system where the leader has done a lot to deconstruct the institutionalization process in the last decade, which is essentially what Xi Jinping has done. Now, Xi Jinping is the leader for life in China now. He is about 66 or 67. So if you're looking at 30 years time frame, he will be just not quite 100. Not impossible. And if we are looking at 30 years ahead to 2050, which incidentally is a time frame that Xi Jinping had himself set as the time frame to achieve what he wanted to achieve. He would have made China great again, to borrow somebody else's famous words. And that China will be shaped after Xi Jinping's own ideas. And it's a China that will not hesitate to put its imprint on the rest of the world. So on that particular kind of scenario construction, it will be a world where the respect for human rights will be less, where democracies will be diminished, where the like of President Putin, he may not still be leader in Russia, but somebody like him would find it a world to flourish in, as long as he is willing to play second fiddle to Xi Jinping. Now, of course, there is the alternative, which is that Xi Jinping doesn't live for another 30 years and stay leader of China for another 30 years, or that things do not progress in the way that Xi Jinping would have liked to. But there is no reason to assume that China is on a trajectory that is going to hit a crisis point anytime soon. Over a longer period time frame than say 5 years, who knows? The world changes so fast in the modern world. But in that scenario, we're going to see a lot of changes to the world because China itself changes, and those changes can unleash all kinds of forces. And for a system that is moving so hard and so fast into an authoritarian direction, if and when it get into serious trouble, it usually have released disruptive forces. Sorry for not being able to be more optimistic.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I suppose what we have to do now, looking at the time, is pull this conference together. And what I would like to do, first of all, is say a massive thank you to both Ram Madhav and Steve Tsang for their wisdom and their honesty. Some very honest answers to the questions there. I think the other thing as well, a big thank you to the audience as well for some of the excellent questions that you sent in to us. And I'm only sorry we couldn't take more of them, but obviously time is very limited. And I think the final thing that I would say before I hand you back to our compere Neeti is that we've covered an awful lot of ground tonight. We've perhaps not come up with too many answers, which isn't a surprise when you consider the complexity of the issues that we were talking about. But I think the key to all of this is that people were honest and people were talking. And maybe if we can continue to talk to each other, then we will find a way to resolve some of these issues and our collaboration will get better and better. So that's all from me. Thank you all very much indeed. And I'd like to hand back now to our compere at Neeti.
Thank you very much to Andy and our panelists for sharing their insights and expertise. Thank you to you, our virtual audience. We hope you will continue churning these ideas in your own circles. If you would like to learn more about Vichaar Manthan or support us by investing in ideas that matter, please visit vichaarmanthan.org or click on the links below this video. We now have a 30-minute break prior to our fireside titled Understanding Trump, where we will be joined by Suhag Shukla, the Executive Director of the Hindu American Foundation. Before our break, a quick preview of our lineup for tomorrow. We have 3 fireside conversations beginning at 3 p.m. British Standard Time. Our main panel discussion titled Institutionalizing Religion, Can It Be Sustainable? Will start at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Register at the link below for full details and our speaker lineup. We invite you to take a break and join us back here in half an hour for our very first fireside discussion. Namaste.